Roy Dunlap had carried the photograph so long that the edges had gone soft as worn leather, the image itself beginning to blur at the corners like a half-remembered dream. And every single night before he blew out the lantern, he would hold it up to the dying light and study the face of a woman he had never spoken a single word to in his entire life. The photograph had come to him through circumstances that he still struggled to explain, even to himself. He had purchased it along with a box of miscellaneous goods at an estate auction in Abilene, Kansas, back in the summer of 1878, when he had been fresh off a cattle drive and flush with enough money to think about settling down. The box had contained a rusted compass, 2 volumes of poetry he never read, a cracked leather belt, and tucked between the pages of a small Bible, that photograph. She was standing in front of what appeared to be a general store, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet that she was holding by its ribbon, as if she had just taken it off or was deciding whether to put it on. There was something defiant in her posture, something warm and unguarded in the slight curve of her mouth. She was not smiling broadly, not performing for the camera the way most people did when confronted with a photographer's lens. She was simply present, almost caught in a private moment, and whoever had taken the photograph had managed to capture something deeply real about her. Roy had looked at that face and felt something shift inside his chest, something fundamental and rearranging, the way a river changes course after a flood. He had asked around in Abilene, described the photograph to anyone who might know whose estate had been auctioned off, but the answers were vague. An old homesteader had died without family, they said. His goods had been scattered to whoever would bid. The man's name had been Henderson, but no one could say where he had come from originally or who the woman in the photograph might be. Roy had carried her face westward with him. He had staked his claim on a parcel of land outside a small town called Redemption, in the New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1879. It was good land, hard land, land that required everything he had to give it. He built a house with his own hands, a proper house with 2 rooms and a real floor and windows that had actual glass in them, because he had always believed that if you built something you should build it right. He planted a kitchen garden. He negotiated water rights with the neighboring rancher, a broad, sun-weathered man named Cal Briggs who respected a straight deal and became as close to a friend as Roy had managed in years of solitary living. The town of Redemption itself was the kind of place that existed by sheer stubborn will. It had a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Alvarez, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a small church where the preacher also served as the town's unofficial doctor, and a saloon called the Dusty Rose that Roy visited on Saturdays when the week's work was done, and his own silence had grown too heavy to carry. He was not a man who drank to excess. He sat at the bar, nursed a single glass of rye, and listened to other men talk, and occasionally talked himself, because he understood that a man who never said anything to anyone eventually forgot how to say anything at all. He was 28 years old. He had been a cowboy most of his working life, had driven cattle from Texas north through Kansas more times than he could count on both hands, had learned every lesson the trail had to teach about endurance and patience and reading, weather from a sky that told no lies. He was tall, lean in the way that hard work makes a man lean rather than thin, with dark eyes that sat quietly in a sun-dark face and hands that were permanently calloused from rope and saddle and hammer. He was, by most measures of the time and place, doing well. He had land, a solid house, a good horse named Buckwheat, and enough cattle that next spring's drive should put him ahead of where he needed to be. He had no complaints, precisely. He had only that quiet ache that settles into a man when his life is full of useful things and empty of someone to share them with. It was Cal Briggs who first mentioned the mail-order-bride arrangement. They were mending fence one October afternoon, the sky enormous and pale blue overhead, the kind of sky that New Mexico Territory offered as though it were trying to make up for the severity of everything else. Cal was a widower himself, had been for 5 years, and had recently remarried through a correspondence arrangement with a woman from Missouri who had turned out to be, by all accounts, a steady and cheerful companion. He hammered a nail with the confidence of a man who had recently been proven right about something. "I am telling you, Roy, the agency in Santa Fe is reputable," Cal said. "Margaret corresponded with 3 women before she found the right one. The agency that handled her end does good work. They match people carefully, or at least more carefully than you might expect." Roy drove a post deeper into the ground with a heavy mallet. "I'm not entirely sure I know how to correspond with anyone. You write letters. You say what you are and what you have and what you are looking for. The woman writes back and says the same things. You get to know each other through words before you ever meet in person. There is something honest about it, actually. No pretense of courtship dances when you both know what the arrangement is from the start." Roy leaned on the mallet and looked out across his land, the dry grass gold in the afternoon light, the dark line of the mountains beyond. He thought about the woman in the photograph. He thought about how foolish it was to carry a stranger's face in his shirt pocket like a talisman. He thought about the winters coming, about how last January he had gone 4 days without speaking to another human soul, and had started talking to buckwheat just to hear language moving through the air. "I will think about it," he said. He thought about it for 3 weeks, and then he wrote to the agency in Santa Fe. He was not, he discovered, a poor letter writer. There was something about the form that suited him, the way it gave him time to think before he committed a word, the way it invited a kind of honest precision. He wrote about his land and his house and his cattle. He wrote about redemption and the surrounding territory, described the landscape fairly, included both its beauties and its hardships. He wrote that he was a man who had spent most of his life outdoors and who valued quiet, who worked hard and meant what he said, who wanted to build something lasting and hoped to build it alongside a woman who shared those intentions. The agency responded promptly. A woman named Hester Boone had expressed strong interest in his correspondence. They enclosed a brief letter from her, and they told him, as part of their standard procedure, that a portrait photograph of Miss Boone would follow shortly by separate post. Roy read her letter 3 times the evening it arrived. She wrote with a directness that surprised him pleasantly. She was 23 years old, from a small town in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died 2 years ago, leaving her and her mother in difficult circumstances. Her mother had since gone to live with a sister in St. Louis, and Hester had worked as a seamstress, and then briefly as a teacher herself at the church school. She was not writing to him out of desperation, she said clearly, but out of genuine intention to build a life in the West, which she had thought about for a long time. She wanted land and open air and the kind of work that built something real. She said she was not afraid of difficulty, but she was honest about the fact that she had never lived outside of a small town. She asked 3 questions in the letter. What was the nearest doctor? Was the church in Redemption a proper church or just a room with a cross over the door? And did he have a dog, because she was not fond of dogs? Roy smiled at that last question. He wrote back that the nearest doctor was also the preacher, and was 17 miles distant in a town called Copper Creek, that the church in Redemption had a proper bell and a proper door and windows, and that he did not currently have a dog, but that he had nothing against them in principle. Their correspondence continued for 6 weeks. Each letter from Hester arrived with that same quality of directness, laced with a dry humor that he found himself looking forward to the way he used to look forward to the end of a long ride, with genuine and growing anticipation. She told him about her town in Missouri, about helping her father grade schoolwork when she was young, about learning to sew from a woman in the congregation who had told her that a woman who could not sew was like a house without a roof. She told him about a horse she had loved as a girl, and about how she had cried when it was sold, and then said she was embarrassed to have admitted that in a letter. He wrote back that there was nothing embarrassing about it, that he had formed significant attachments to horses himself and considered them among the more reliably decent creatures on earth. He realized gradually and with something like wonder, enjoying himself. He was also waiting for the photograph. The agency's letter had said it would come by separate post. 3 letters had arrived from Hester without the photograph following from the agency. He wrote to the agency asking after it. They replied apologetically that there had been some difficulty with the photographer in Missouri and that the portrait was delayed but would arrive soon. When it finally came, on a cold, gray afternoon in late November, Roy was just coming in from tending the cattle. He found the envelope on his table, delivered earlier in the day while he was out. He set it down, washed the cold from his hands at the basin, and stood for a moment looking at the envelope as if giving himself time to prepare. He opened it carefully. He held the photograph up to the fading gray light from the window. For a long moment he did not breathe. It was her, not a woman who resembled her, not a coincidence of dark hair and a certain quality of expression. It was the woman from the photograph he had been carrying in his pocket for a year and a half, the one salvaged from a dead man's estate in Abilene, the one whose face he had memorized so thoroughly he could have drawn it from memory on the back of any envelope. She was standing in the same posture, the same quality of defiant presence in her shoulders, the same bonnet held by its ribbon in one hand. It was not the same photograph, he realized when he looked more carefully. The dress was different, the background behind her was the front of a different building, but it was unmistakably, undeniably, the same woman. He set both photographs side by side on the table and sat down heavily in his chair. The woman he had been carrying in his pocket. The woman who had set up residence in some quiet chamber of his imagination and refused to leave. The woman he had loved, in whatever strange private way a man can love an image he has never given a name to. Her name was Hester Boone. She was already writing him letters about whether he preferred corn bread or proper loaf bread, and whether he thought it was reasonable for a woman to wear trousers while working a garden. He sat with this for a long time. Then he wrote her the most careful letter he had ever written in his life. He did not mention the photographs. He was not sure at that moment why he did not mention them. Perhaps because he could not yet find the words for it. Perhaps because the whole circumstance was so improbable that he was afraid of saying it badly, of sounding like a man who had lost his reason. He told her he was looking forward to her arrival. He told her he had prepared the house as well as he knew how. He told her that he was glad she had written to him. He put both photographs in the Bible on his table, the salvaged one and the new one, placed them face to face like a conversation between 2 versions of the same woman, and he tried to sleep. She was to arrive on the stage from Santa Fe on the first Wednesday of December, 1879. Roy was at the stage stop in Redemption an hour early. This was not unusual. He was a man who arrived early for everything. He had not slept particularly well in the 2 weeks since he had received her photograph, and he had used the sleeplessness productively, making sure the house was clean and ordered, acquiring a second proper chair, stocking the root cellar thoroughly, and splitting enough firewood to last through February. He had also, in a moment he was not entirely proud of, tried to think through every possible way to explain to a woman he had never met that he had been carrying a photograph of her for over a year before he knew who she was. He had not arrived at a satisfying explanation. Cal Briggs had come to meet the stage as well, partly out of general neighborly interest in the event, and partly because his wife Margaret was also coming in to welcome Hester, having decided that the woman would need a friendly female face after a long journey. Margaret Briggs was a sturdy, warm woman of 40 who had an immediate and disarming quality of making everyone feel as though they had already been friends for years. Roy was grateful for her presence. The stage arrived 40 minutes late, which was actually good by local standards. Roy watched it come down the main street of Redemption in a cloud of pale dust and the sound of laboring horses. He was aware of his own heartbeat with an unusual clarity. He had told himself many times over the past weeks that the photograph coincidence was a curiosity, nothing more. That the Hester Boone who stepped off that stage would be a real person, complicated and whole, and that any feelings he had developed were attached to an image rather than to her. He had warned himself not to project. He had tried very hard to be sensible. The stage door opened. A man in a traveling coat got out first, then a woman in her 50s with a large bag. Then Hester Boone stepped down onto the packed dirt of Redemption's Main Street, and Roy's carefully constructed sensibleness came apart completely. She was wearing a dark green traveling dress, and she was carrying a small trunk in one hand and a large bag in the other, because apparently she was not someone who waited for assistance if she could manage it herself. Her dark hair was coming slightly loose from its arrangement after the long journey. There was dust on her hem, and she was squinting in the bright winter sun, assessing the street and the buildings with a rapid, comprehensive gaze that reminded him immediately of the expression in both photographs. She was looking at the town of Redemption the way someone looks at a thing they have already decided to take seriously. She was exactly herself. That was the only way he could think to describe it. She was exactly the woman whose face he had memorized, and she was also far more than that photograph had been able to hold. She turned and her eyes found him immediately, because he was the tallest person standing near the stage, and probably the one most obviously waiting for someone, and her expression shifted from that rapid assessment to something more uncertain and more real. "Mr. Dunlap," she said. Not a question exactly. A careful statement. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Welcome to Redemption." She set down the large bag and extended her hand to shake his, which was not what most women did when meeting a man for the first time in a formal introduction, and he liked it very much. Her handshake was firm. "You are taller than I expected," she said. "You wrote that you were not fond of dogs," he said. "I thought about it and decided I agree with you." She blinked, and then she laughed, a real laugh, sudden and warm and completely unrehearsed, and Roy felt the last 2 months of correspondence click into place around this actual person, and understood that he was in considerable difficulty. Margaret Briggs descended upon them both with great warmth, embracing Hester as if they were old friends, and talking rapidly about the house and the territory and the women of the church, and Roy stood slightly to the side holding Hester's trunk and feeling something enormous and complicated moving through his chest. He had a great deal to think about, starting with the 2 photographs side by side in the Bible on his table. They were married the following Saturday. This was the custom of the time and the arrangement. Both of them had agreed through correspondence to be married promptly after her arrival, understanding that the practical necessities of the situation required it. There was no suitable place for Hester to stay for an extended period in Redemption, and the arrangement had been clearly established in their letters. Roy had been honest in his letters about his intentions and his circumstances. She had been equally honest about hers. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Calloway, who had ridden in from Copper Creek for the occasion, and who was a comfortable, round-faced man with an excellent handshake and a pragmatic view of frontier weddings. There were perhaps a dozen witnesses, including Cal and Margaret Briggs, Mrs. Alvarez from the general store, and a couple of the neighboring ranchers. Hester wore a dress that she had made herself, cream-colored with small blue flowers along the collar. Roy wore his best coat, which was dark wool and had only one small burn near the cuff from a campfire incident 2 years ago. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him down the short aisle, and thought that whatever had happened in his life before this moment had been the long, circuitous route to arriving here. The ceremony was simple and earnest. Reverend Calloway spoke about the gravity of the commitment and the particular character of a life built on frontier land, which was a different kind of life than most and required a particular kind of partnership. When he asked Roy if he took this woman as his wife, Roy said yes with a steadiness he was grateful for. When he asked Hester the same question, she said yes clearly and without hesitation, and looked directly at Roy as she said it. After the ceremony, at the small gathering at Cal and Margaret's house, Roy found himself standing near the fireplace with a cup of coffee, watching Hester talk to Margaret with an ease and naturalness that said something good about her character. She was not performing ease. She genuinely seemed to relax into company quickly, to find the interesting thing in whatever she was given, which he had suspected from her letters, but it was something else entirely to see it in person. Cal came to stand beside him and said, very quietly, "She is a good one, Roy." "Yes," Roy said. He meant it with everything he had. That evening, they drove back to the house together in the wagon as the sun went down behind the western mountains and turned the sky an improbable sequence of colors, pink becoming orange, becoming a deep clear purple. Hester sat beside him on the wagon seat, and they were quiet for a while in a way that did not feel uncomfortable, the way good silences feel when they belong to two people equally. "The mountains are beautiful," she said. "They are this time of evening. In Missouri, everything was green but close. The sky was always interrupted by trees or hills." She paused. "Here the sky seems to have no end. You get used to it," he said, "and then you stop being able to imagine living anywhere it isn't this big." She looked at him then, with a quality of attention that he was beginning to understand was characteristic of her. She looked at people as if she was genuinely interested in the particular thing they had just said. "Was it difficult," she said, "leaving the cattle-driving life, living in one place after all that moving?" "I thought it might be," he said, "but I found that what I had been doing all those years on the trail was looking for the right piece of ground. When I found it, staying on it was not difficult at all." She seemed to consider this carefully. Then she said, "I have never seen a piece of ground I was sure was mine. I hope this is it." "I hope so too," he said quietly. The house was warm when they arrived. He had left a fire banked before going into town that morning, and he had also, in a moment of careful planning, left a lamp lit in the window. It glowed amber against the dark when they came across the land toward it, and he heard Hester make a small sound beside him that might have been approval, might have been something more than that. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at it carefully, at the solid walls and the real floor and the two chairs by the fire and the shelves that held his small collection of books and the properly hung curtains that Margaret Briggs had helped him put up 2 weeks ago. He watched her take it in. "It is good," she said quietly. "It is really quite good." He felt an absurd surge of pride and gratitude combined. "Your room is through there," he said, gesturing to the second room. He had fixed it up carefully, put fresh linen on the bed, left a lamp on the table. "I sleep here near the fire." She turned and looked at him with that direct gaze. "That is very considerate. We have all the time to get to know each other that we need," he said. "There is no rush." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, and the particular quality of that nod told him that she had needed to hear that, and that she was grateful for it in a way she was not yet comfortable expressing. Roy lay near the fire that night and could not sleep, not from worry but from an overwhelming aliveness that he was not accustomed to. The house was different with her in it. The air itself was different. He was aware, in some deep and cellular way, that everything had changed. He also knew that he was going to have to tell her about the photograph. Not yet, but soon. He could not imagine building anything honest with her while carrying that particular secret, and he already knew, with a certainty that surprised him with its speed, that what he wanted to build with her was honest. He was, God help him, already halfway in love with a woman he had known for exactly 1 week. The first month of their marriage was a careful, incremental getting to know each other that Roy found himself savoring in a way he had not expected. They fell into rhythms of work that felt natural, that arranged themselves with a minimum of friction. Hester was competent and honest about the things she did not yet know, which was a rare quality. She asked rather than guessing and making a mess. She learned quickly and retained what she learned. She had strong opinions about the kitchen garden and immediately reorganized his root cellar in a way that was, he had to admit, significantly more logical than what he had been doing. She was also funny, in a way that snuck up on you. She had a dry, observational humor that came out unexpectedly, a perfectly timed comment about a contrary chicken or the behavior of the neighbor's dog, delivered in a tone so matter-of-fact that it took a moment to register as a joke, and then arrived with full force. Roy had not laughed easily in years, and she made him laugh regularly, and each time it happened she seemed both pleased and slightly surprised. They talked in the evenings by the fire. This became, quickly, the part of the day Roy most looked forward to. They talked about everything, in the way you can only talk when you have committed to sharing a life, and the conversational territory is therefore unlimited. She told him about her childhood, about her father's schoolroom and the books she had read, and the way her father had believed fiercely that women's minds were as capable as men's, and had taught her accordingly. She told him about the years after his death, the quiet poverty and the endless sewing, and the sense that she was waiting for something that her life in Missouri was not going to contain. He told her about the cattle drives, about the men he had worked alongside, about the particular loneliness of being very good at a life that was, by its nature, temporary. He told her about finding the land outside redemption and the feeling that had come over him, something like recognition. He did not yet tell her about the photograph. He kept trying to find the right moment, and something in him kept pulling back, not from dishonesty, but from a peculiar shyness that he could not entirely account for. The story of the photograph was also the story of how thoroughly she had gotten under his skin before he ever spoke a word to her, and that felt like handing someone a considerable amount of power over you. It was Cal Briggs who forced the issue, and not intentionally. On a cold Saturday in January, Roy and Cal were in town at the Dusty Rose, sharing the usual Saturday whiskey, and Hester was with Margaret at the general store. Roy had the photographs with him as he always had the original one, out of habit more than anything else, and when Cal asked him about something in his coat pocket, Roy pulled it out without thinking. Cal looked at it. He looked at Roy. He looked at the photograph again. "Is that Hester?" Cal said. "Yes," Roy said. "When was this taken? Before she arrived?" "This photograph," Roy said, and then stopped. He started again. "This photograph came to me from an estate auction in Abilene in the summer of 1878. I have been carrying it since then." Cal stared at him for a long, slow moment. "Roy," he said carefully, "are you telling me you were carrying a photograph of your wife before you knew she existed?" "That is what I am telling you." Cal set down his glass. He picked it back up. He set it down again. "Does she know?" "Not yet." "You need to tell her," Cal said, with the absolute certainty of a man who had been married twice and understood what happened when things were left untold. "I know," Roy said. "Tonight," Cal said. "I was planning on it," Roy said, which was only partially true. He had been planning on it in the abstract, theoretical way a person plans something they are afraid of. He told her that evening. They were in the chairs by the fire after supper, the best moment of the day, the lamp burning golden, Hester with a piece of mending in her hands and Roy with a cup of coffee cooling beside him. He had rehearsed several opening lines and abandoned all of them. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out the photograph and held it out to her. She set down the mending and took it, looked at it for a moment with a little furrow between her brows, and then looked up at him. "That is me," she said. "Yes." "This is not the photograph the agency sent you." "No." A silence. The fire cracked. "Roy," she said very carefully, "where did you get this?" He told her everything. The estate auction in Abilene in 1878, the box of miscellaneous goods, the Bible with the photograph tucked inside. Not knowing her name, not knowing anything about her, only having this image, carrying it westward, building his house. The months of trying to find out who she was, and then receiving her photograph from the agency and recognizing her immediately, feeling the floor shift beneath him. Hester listened without interrupting. She was very still. When he finished, she looked at the photograph in her hand for a long time. "You loved a photograph of me for a year and a half," she said. It was not quite a question. "I thought about what I was doing, and I know it sounds peculiar," he said. I am aware that loving a photograph is not the same as loving a person, but something about that image took hold of me and I could not shake it. I told myself it was foolish. I kept carrying it anyway. What was it? She said. What did you see in it? He thought carefully before answering because she deserved a careful answer. The way you were standing, he said, not performing for the camera. Just being there in that particular moment, completely yourself. It seemed like something very rare. Hester looked at the photograph again and then at him, and something in her expression was doing something complex that he could not entirely read. Do you know whose Bible it was? She said. The one it was tucked in. A man named Henderson. No one in Abilene knew much about him. Henderson, she repeated, and something shifted in her face. My father had a student whose family name was Henderson. They moved away from our town when I was perhaps 14. An older man, the grandfather, I think. He used to come and talk with my father sometimes. She paused. He took a great interest in photography. He had a camera. They looked at each other. That is not proof of anything, Roy said. No, she agreed, but it is less improbable than it was a moment ago. Another silence. The fire had burned down slightly and the room was warmer with shadow. I need you to understand something, Hester said. She had set the mending aside entirely and was holding the photograph in both hands and looking at him with that full attention that he had come to know as her most serious mode. I came out here because I intended to. Because I had thought carefully about this territory and this kind of life, and I believed I could make something real here. I did not come chasing romance. I came because I chose to, with my eyes open. I know that, he said. I understood that from your letters. But I also need to tell you, she said, and her voice changed slightly, became more careful, that these weeks have been different from what I expected, in a way I did not plan for. He waited. I expected partnership, she said. I expected practical arrangement and honest work and gradual respect. What I did not expect was to find a person I actually wanted to talk to. A person I looked forward to talking to. Every evening. She paused. That is more than I bargained for, and I am not sure what to do with it. You could just let it be, he said quietly. What it is. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached over and put the photograph on the table between them, face up. She looks ready to take on something, Hester said, looking at the image of herself. She does, Roy agreed. I think I was ready to take on something, she said, but I had not yet figured out what it was. Roy looked at her in the firelight, at this extraordinary woman sitting across from him who had arrived as a stranger and was rapidly becoming the thing he had not known he was building his life toward. I am glad you figured it out, he said. Her eyes met his, and there was something warm and bright in them that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there and was now no longer concealed. So am I, she said. He reached across the small space between the chairs and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a long time while the fire burned down and the wind moved across the land outside, and the two photographs lay side by side on the table. A year and a half of strange, circling fate contained in those small pieces of paper. Winter deepened, and they moved through it together. There was a particular intimacy to winter on the frontier, Roy had always thought, that came from the way it compacted life into small spaces. The cold drove you inside, and inside you found whoever you were sharing the walls with, and the truth of whether you suited each other came out whether you wanted it to or not. He had spent winters alone on this land, and they had been endurable. They had been useful, in the way that solitude can be useful, clarifying. But winter with Hester in the house was something else entirely. She took over the second chair completely. She made it hers in 100 small ways, a particular quilt folded over the arm, her sewing basket on the floor beside it, a book always open on the small table she had moved next to it. She read widely and talked about what she read, which he enjoyed immensely. She had a habit in the evenings of reading something she found interesting aloud, not asking him if he wanted to hear it, just reading it out with a kind of certainty that of course he would be interested, and the certainty was almost always justified. She was also deeply practical in ways that made his daily life measurably better. She organized the household with an efficiency that was not cold or impersonal, but that had a kind of quality he had not expected, a sense of pleasure in good order, as if a well-organized house were a form of expression. She made the kitchen garden work in the cold months better than he had ever managed. She negotiated firmly with Mrs. Alvarez at the general store and always came home with a better arrangement than he would have managed. He fell in love with her the way winter becomes spring, not all at once, but through a gradual accumulation of evidence that something fundamental had changed. He fell in love with the way she said his name, Roy, just Roy, not Mr. Dunlap as she had called him that first day, but Roy in her particular voice that always seemed to contain something she was thinking at the same time she was speaking. He fell in love with the way she took off her bonnet when she came inside, always with both hands and a slight sigh of relief, as if the bonnet were an obligation she was glad to lay down. He fell in love with her hands moving through dough in the mornings, capable and sure. He fell in love with the way she looked out the window at the mountains and went quiet, and whatever she was thinking in those moments was entirely her own. There was a morning in February when a late storm came down off the mountains and blanketed everything in a sudden thick white silence. Roy came in from the barn after seeing to the cattle, covered in snow, cold to the bone. Hester was at the stove and she turned when he came in and immediately said nothing at all, but handed him a cup of hot coffee that was already prepared, as if she had known the exact moment he would come through the door. He stood there with the snow melting off his coat and looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "Hester, I love you." And it came out with none of the careful preamble he had imagined for that sentence, just directly and simply and true. She looked at him for a long beat. Her hands were still around the coffee cup she had not quite released. "I know," she said, and her voice was soft. "I have known for a while. I have been trying to determine what the right thing to say back is." "Say whatever is true," he said. "The true thing," she said, "is that I did not expect to feel this. I have been arguing with myself about it because it seemed too fast and too large, and I am not someone who does things impulsively. But it is true." She took a breath. "I love you too, Roy. I have, I think, for several weeks at least, and probably longer." He set the coffee down on the table and crossed the room and took her face in his cold hands very gently, and she did not flinch from the cold. She put her hands over his. They stood like that in the kitchen, with the snow blowing beyond the window and the stove warm and orange beside them, and said nothing else because nothing else was needed. He kissed her for the first time with the snow still melting in his hair, and she kissed him back with a warmth and a sureness that made him understand that she had meant every word. Spring arrived in the New Mexico territory with a particular fierce brightness, as if the landscape were making up for what it had withheld through the cold months. The grass came back gold-green on the hillsides, and the mountains lost their snow caps incrementally, and Hester's kitchen garden began to show rows of green pushing through the dark-turned earth with a confidence that matched her own character. The town of Redemption grew somewhat that spring. A new family arrived from Texas and set up a small farm to the north of Roy's land. A couple named Tomas and Elena Vega with 3 children and a considerable amount of determination. Elena Vega spoke excellent English and went directly to Hester on their second day in the territory and asked if she could look at her kitchen garden. And after that the 2 women formed a friendship that pleased Roy enormously because he could see in Hester the way good female companionship filled something different than he could fill, something equally necessary. The Vega family also brought news that was not entirely cheerful. There had been trouble along the southern route from Santa Fe, a dispute between land agents and a group of settlers over water rights that had gotten ugly. Nothing had directly touched Redemption yet, but the edges of the trouble were spreading north, and Roy paid attention to this with the careful watchfulness of a man who had worked enough of the territory to know that trouble in the south always eventually arrived. Cal Briggs took it more seriously than Roy did, initially. Cal had more land and more cattle, and therefore more that could be affected by complications to water agreements. He called a meeting of the neighboring landholders one Saturday in April at his place, and Roy and Hester rode over together. Hester was not the only woman there. Margaret Briggs sat at the table as an equal partner in everything Cal did, and Elena Vega came with Tomas. There were 4 other men, neighboring ranchers and farmers, and a man named Douglas Farr who worked for the Territorial Land Office and had come up from Santa Fe with specific knowledge of what was happening. Farr was a thin, precise man who wore glasses and spoke carefully. He explained that a land speculator named Calhoun had been buying up water rights across several counties and was now attempting to charge fees for access to water sources that had been commonly held. He explained that several small farmers and ranchers had already been forced off their land, and that there had been some altercations, and that the territorial government was attempting to address it but moving slowly. "What I would recommend to everyone in this room," Farr said, "is that you have your land documents and your water rights documentation reviewed and properly registered. If everything is in order, you are in a better position. If there are gaps or ambiguities in your documentation, now is the time to address them rather than later." Roy looked at Hester beside him. He had his land documents, had always been careful about that. But there was a water access agreement between him and Cal that had been made verbally, informally, the kind of arrangement that worked perfectly well between neighbors who trusted each other but provided nothing in writing. "Cal," he said quietly, after the meeting, when people were beginning to leave. "Our water agreement." "I know," Cal said. He looked slightly embarrassed. "Margaret has been telling me for a year we ought to get that written down properly." "Margaret was right," Roy said. "Margaret is frequently right," Cal said, in the tone of a man who had made peace with this. They arranged to ride to Copper Creek the following week and have the agreement properly drawn up and registered. It was a half-day's ride each way, and Roy made a day of it, taking Hester along because she had never been to Copper Creek and because he simply liked her company on a long ride. She was an excellent rider, he discovered. She had downplayed this in her letters, said only that she could manage a horse, which was the kind of understatement that he was coming to recognize as characteristic. She sat a horse with an ease and confidence that came from real practice. When he said this, she told him that her father had kept 2 horses and that she had been riding since before she could properly remember. Copper Creek was a larger town than Redemption by some measure, with a proper main street and a courthouse and 2 hotels and a newspaper office. They registered the water agreement with the Land Records Office without difficulty, and while they were at it, Roy had a clerk double-check all of his other property documents, which were all in order. After the official business was done, Roy bought Hester lunch at the better of the 2 hotels, a real lunch with a proper table and a tablecloth, which was not something they had occasion for often. She seemed delighted by it, not in an overwrought way but in the genuine, appreciating manner that was characteristic of her. She had ordered the pie at the end of the meal with a decisiveness that made him smile, and when it arrived she ate it with a concentrated pleasure that he found absurdly charming. "This is very good pie," she said. "It is indeed. We should come to Copper Creek more often purely on the basis of this pie. I will make note of that as a policy." She looked at him across the table in the restaurant with its linen tablecloth and its slightly pretentious wallpaper and said, "I like this, going places with you, doing ordinary things together." She paused. "I had not thought that being married would feel this much like friendship. I had expected it to feel more like an arrangement." "I had hoped for something more than arrangement," he said. "I am glad we both arrived at the same place." "So am I." She smiled at him, full and warm, and he thought that this moment, this particular ordinary moment, a hotel restaurant, a tablecloth, a piece of pie, this was what all of it had been building toward, and it was more than sufficient. It was everything. They rode home in the late afternoon with the mountains going pink on their western faces and the wide sky performing its usual impossible colors overhead. Summer came with its enormous heat, and its particular relentlessness. Roy and Hester worked the land through the long, bright days, and in the evenings sat outside on the bench he had built against the south wall of the house to catch the cooling air. They watched the stars come out, which was something you could do properly in New Mexico territory because the sky was fully dark and the stars were fully present, not dimmed by any city light or interrupted by any hills. Hester had learned the constellations from her father, and she taught them to Roy, pointing out each pattern with the same matter-of-fact authority she brought to everything. The cattle drive in the late summer was a concern. Roy had been planning to send his cattle north with a shared drive organized by Cal and two of the other neighboring ranchers, a reasonable and customary arrangement. But the trouble from the south had crept northward exactly as he had anticipated, and in July there was a direct confrontation involving Calhoun's men and a homesteader family on the road through the lower canyon, an incident that left property destroyed and the homesteader's barn burned, though the family themselves were unharmed. The drive was delayed while people assessed whether the route was safe. Roy went to 2 meetings about it, both times with Hester either at the meeting or waiting for a full account when he returned. She had clear opinions about what should be done and expressed them directly, which he brought back to the subsequent meeting as his own contribution to the discussion, and then thought to ask whether he might bring her to the next meeting outright. There was some initial hesitation about this. The cattle drive meetings had always been exclusively male, not from any explicit rule, but from the usual assumptions of the time. Roy pointed out that Hester had a half-interest in the cattle they were discussing, which was factually true and difficult to argue with, and Cal backed him up, citing Margaret's involvement in all of their own decisions. And after a brief awkward shuffling of expectations, Hester sat at the table, and the meeting was considerably more productive. It was Hester who suggested the alternative route north, a longer way around the canyon that added 2 days to the drive, but avoided the territory that Calhoun's men had been operating in. She had been talking with Alina Vega, whose husband had ridden the area recently and had a clear picture of the geography. Roy had known about the alternative route but had not raised it because he had assumed it would be dismissed as impractical. Hester raised it with specific details and without apologizing for raising it, and it was adopted. The drive went without incident and returned the best prices Roy had seen in 3 years. He told her this when he came home from the drive, dusty and tired, and enormously glad to see her standing on the porch as he rode up in the evening. He climbed down from buckwheat and she came down the steps to meet him, and he put his arms around her without saying anything first, just held her for a moment in the yard. "How did it go?" she said against his shoulder. "Your route was right," he said. "No trouble, good prices." She pulled back and looked up at him with something that was not quite a smile but that contained considerable satisfaction. "Good," she said. "I was fairly certain I was right." "You usually are," he said. "Not always," she said, "but enough." He laughed and kissed her in the yard in the evening light with the horses watching and the kitchen garden breathing green around them and the house he had built with his own hands warm and lit behind her. Autumn of 1880 came in on a cool northwest wind that smelled of pine and something sharp and clean that Roy always associated with the changing of seasons. There was a considerable peace in their life together, not the static peace of things that have simply stopped moving, but the deeper peace of things that have found their proper motion. He woke in the mornings with something that he understood now was happiness, the particular happiness of a life that has been aligned with its own intentions. They had been talking, carefully, in the way they talked about serious things, about growing the herd next season, about whether there was any wisdom in adding a small income from the garden if they could get more organized about selling produce to the town. Hester had also raised the possibility with characteristic directness that the second room might eventually need to become a different kind of room. He had looked at her when she said this, and she had met his look with her steady gaze and a slight color in her cheeks. "Is that something you are thinking about seriously?" he asked. "I think about it," she said carefully. "I have not made a decree about it. I am raising it as a subject of conversation." "I am glad you raised it," he said. "As a subject of conversation, I am entirely in favor of the general direction of it." She had laughed at that, a short, bright laugh, and the color in her cheeks had deepened, and he had reached across the table and taken her hand, and they had sat like that for a while and talked about it more directly, about what they wanted, and when and how they were both feeling about the life they were building together. It was in the late fall of 1880 that Hester told him quietly one morning, with her eyes bright and her hands folded on the table in front of her with a very deliberate steadiness, that there was going to be a child. Roy sat very still for a moment. Then he got up from his chair and went to her and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and his voice when it came was not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I feel quite well, actually. Margaret says that is a good sign. Margaret knows. I told her 2 days ago I needed someone to talk to who had experience. I hope you are not bothered by that." "Of course not." He squeezed her hands. "Hester." "Yes." "I am extraordinarily happy," he said. "I want you to know that clearly and completely." She looked at him and her eyes were bright. "So am I," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I told you, and now I am sure and I am very happy." He kissed her hands. He stood up and put his arms around her gently, and she leaned into him, and they stood in the kitchen with the morning sun coming through the window and the garden visible through the glass, the last of the autumn harvest still showing in the beds, and he was aware of the magnitude of this moment, of this woman, of this life he had stumbled into through a set of circumstances so improbable they still made him marvel. He thought about the photograph, about finding it in a dead man's Bible in Abilene, about carrying her face across the territory, across a year and a half of cattle drives and fence posts and silent evenings, not knowing her name, and then finding her through the most ordinary possible mechanism, a letter written to an agency in Santa Fe, and discovering that the face he had loved without knowing was the same face looking back at him from the correspondence photograph. About her stepping off the stage in Redemption in her green dress with her trunk in one hand and her bag in the other, squinting in the winter sun. He thought he would tell their child this story someday, when the child was old enough to understand that the world sometimes does improbable things that are nevertheless true. The Calhoun situation resolved itself in the early winter, which was a relief to everyone. The territorial government, pushed by enough complaints and the involvement of the Land Records Office, had appointed a proper adjudicator who had gone through the water rights documentation thoroughly and found that Calhoun's claimed rights were built on paperwork that had been improperly filed and in several cases fraudulently altered. Calhoun himself had left the territory under circumstances that suggested he had seen the adjudicator's conclusion coming before it was formally announced. Roy had attended the final hearing in Copper Creek with Cal and Tomas Vega and come home with the official confirmation that his water rights were secure and properly registered. He had walked in the door and told Hester, and she had been sitting by the fire with mending in her hands and had said "good" in that particular tone that meant she had expected this outcome all along. "You are not more relieved," he said. "I am relieved," she said, "but I was not particularly worried. You have good documentation and honest claims." Dishonest claims collapse when they are actually examined. That is how it usually goes when the examination is genuine. "You have a great deal of confidence in official processes," he said. "I have a cautious confidence in justice when people insist on it persistently enough," she said, which was a careful enough distinction that he thought about it for some time afterward. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was cold but not brutal. Roy made sure the firewood was more than sufficient, built up the supply to a quantity that was almost excessive, because Hester's comfort through the pregnancy was his primary concern, and he was not going to allow the house to be cold for a single day. She told him he was being somewhat ridiculous. He continued being somewhat ridiculous and stacking wood. She had taken on a new project that winter, had begun to properly organize a school curriculum on paper, making notes on what she would teach if the town ever got enough children together to justify a school. There were currently 11 children in Redemption, and its surrounding territory enough, she argued to Roy and then to the town council that February, to justify a proper school arrangement. She made this argument formally at a town meeting, which Roy attended, and sat beside her while she laid out the argument with a clarity and patience that reminded him of her letters, of that quality she had of thinking carefully before she spoke, and then saying what she meant directly. The town council agreed to the proposal and offered the use of the back room of the church for 3 mornings a week starting in the spring. Roy walked home from that meeting with his arm around her shoulders and said, "You are remarkable." "I am practical," she said. "Those children are wasting time, they could be learning things." "It comes to the same thing," he said. She looked up at him. "Do you really think so?" "I think the impulse to make sure people get what they need is remarkable, whether it expresses itself as impracticality or practicality," he said. She thought about this for a moment. "That is a very kind way to look at it," she said. "I have had a good teacher," he said. She bumped her shoulder gently against his arm, which was her particular form of expressing an affection she was still, sometimes, slightly shy about naming. The spring of 1881 came in mild and generous. Hester's kitchen garden expanded substantially, with Alina Vega's help and participation, into a serious enterprise that supplied a good portion of their own needs and enough surplus to sell a small quantity at the general store. Mrs. Alvarez had been enthusiastic about the arrangement and had given them fair prices. In April, Hester began teaching at the church school 3 mornings a week. She came home from those mornings in a state of energized satisfaction that was particular to that activity, different from the satisfaction of physical work, but equally genuine. She talked about the children in the evenings, about which ones were quick and which needed more time, about the particular challenge and pleasure of finding the right way to explain something to a mind that has not encountered it before. Roy listened and asked questions, and found that these evening conversations were among the most enjoyable of all their evening conversations, because she was most fully herself when she was talking about teaching, most fully in possession of her own certainty and pleasure. In May of 1881, after a labor that was frightening and long and managed with extraordinary calm by both Margaret Briggs and by Hester herself, their son was born. Roy had been outside the door, which was where Margaret had firmly placed him, and he had stood there for what felt like most of his life, listening, until the sound of a baby's voice arrived in the air and he had put his hand flat on the wall of his own house and breathed. Margaret came to the door. "Come in, Roy. Everyone is fine." He went in. Hester was against the pillows, pale and exhausted and completely, blazingly alive, and she was holding their son, and she looked up when Roy came to the bedside and her eyes were full of a light that he had no word for. "Come and meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was small and red-faced and furiously present, and then at his wife and felt something he lacked the vocabulary for, something tremendous and quiet. "He looks very serious," Roy said. "He does," Hester agreed. "I think he will have opinions." "That runs in the family, apparently," Roy said. Hester laughed, softly, tiredly, but a real laugh. Then she leaned her head against Roy's shoulder, and he put his arm around her gently, and they sat together looking at their son. And the afternoon light came through the clean windows and lay across the floor in wide, warm bars. They named him William James Dunlap, for Hester's father, whose name had been James, and for no other particular reason than it suited him. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not in the sense of events always pressing and tumbling, though there were enough of those, but full in the sense of substance, of a life that had weight and warmth and genuine meaning in all its layers. Redemption grew steadily through the early 1880s. The school that Hester had established grew from 11 children to 23 by 1883, and she had negotiated with the town for a proper schoolroom in a new small building at the end of the main street. She continued teaching through all of it with the same matter-of-fact commitment she brought to everything, negotiating time around planting seasons and cattle drives, and the demands of the house with a practicality that impressed everyone who witnessed it. Roy expanded the herd carefully, joined Cal Briggs in a formal partnership for the drives north that proved economically sound for both of them. He also began to think in 1882 about something he had been turning over for a while: a second horse operation, not cattle but good horses for working ranches and farms, because the territory needed them, and he had an eye for a good horse and considerable experience with them. He discussed this extensively with Hester over several weeks of evenings, working through the finances with a thoroughness that was entirely her influence. "It makes sense," she said, finally, having run through everything twice. "You have the land for it. You have the knowledge. The market for good working horses within 30 miles of here is real. You think it is a sound idea." "I think it is a sound idea that you have been dancing around for 4 months because you were not sure I would think it was a sound idea," she said. He opened his mouth and closed it. "It is a good plan," she said. "We should do it." He started the horse operation in the spring of 1883, beginning small with 3 mares, and a good stallion he had found in Copper Creek after considerable searching. By the following spring, he had his first foals and his first sale to a neighboring rancher who sent 3 other people to him within the year. The operation grew by careful word of mouth, the way things grow in small territories where reputation is everything. William grew with the same rapidity that children always surprise you with, moving from the small, serious baby into a small, serious child who had inherited, Roy thought, the best qualities of both of them: his mother's directness and her intellectual energy and her humor, and something of his father's patience and physical ease with the land. By the time William was 3, he was following Roy to the barn with an air of purposeful participation, and by 4 he had strong opinions about which horses he liked and which ones he was uncertain of, and he communicated these opinions with a fluency that made Hester laugh. "He already sounds like you," Roy told her one evening. "I hope he is better at concealing his feelings than you are," she said. "I have never claimed to be particularly good at that," he said. "No," she agreed, with the warmth that she kept in her voice for him now always, the warmth that had been there in her letters before he ever saw her face again, before the photograph coincidence resolved itself, before any of it. The warmth that he had felt was real in her first letter, and had been proven real in every letter since and every day after. In the fall of 1883, their second child arrived. A daughter this time, which delighted William enormously, as he had been extensively informed that a sibling was coming, and had developed strong opinions about this as well. They named her Clara Rose, and she was from the beginning a different kind of person than her brother, easier in her expressions, quicker to laugh, with a quality of warmth that arrived in a room before she did. Roy held Clara on the evening of her birth, and thought about sitting in that auction in Abilene in 1878, about the box of miscellaneous goods, and the Bible and the photograph tucked in its pages. He thought about carrying that image across the territory without knowing whose face it was. He thought about the letter that had arrived from Santa Fe with Hester's careful, direct, unsentimental words. He thought about the photograph from the agency and the moment he had recognized her. He thought about the stage arriving in Redemption in the December cold and Hester stepping down with her trunk in hand and her bonnet by its ribbon. All of that improbable, circling, stubborn chain of events that had delivered him to this exact moment, holding his daughter in the lamplight while his wife rested and his son slept in the next room. He had, once, loved a photograph. He now had a life that no photograph could contain. Hester healed quickly from Clara's birth, as she had from William's, because she was fundamentally a resilient person who did not permit herself to be felled by things when there was work to be done. Within 2 weeks, she was at the table in the evenings with Clara in the crook of one arm and schoolwork in the other hand, which struck Roy as somewhat alarming but was so entirely characteristic of her that he could not argue it. "You could rest," he said. "I am resting," she said. "This is what resting looks like for me." He let it be. The schoolwork that fall was more complex than usual because 2 new families had arrived in the territory that summer and both had school-age children. And the new children had very different educational backgrounds from the existing students, which presented challenges that Hester took on with a focused energy that Roy watched with the same quiet wonder he had always watched her work. She had a gift for it, for finding where a person was and meeting them there, for understanding that a child who had not been taught was not a less capable child, but one who had not yet been reached. She also, in the winter of 1883, wrote a letter to the Territorial Education Authority in Santa Fe about the need for proper teacher training and resources in frontier settlements, a letter that was 3 pages long and carefully argued, and that she showed Roy before she sent it. "You are not going to ask me if you should send it," he said, reading it. "No," she said. "I am showing it to you because I value your opinion. If you thought it was wrong in some important way, I would want to know before it went, but I am sending it." He handed it back to her. "Send it. It is an excellent letter." She folded it with the quiet satisfaction of a decision made and followed through. The Territorial Authority wrote back 3 months later with what amounted to cautious interest, and the suggestion that she might correspond further with a representative who was developing a proposed teacher training program for frontier schools. She corresponded further. It came to something eventually, though that is a longer story of its own. The spring of 1884 brought a late freeze that nearly took the new foals Roy had been watching carefully for weeks. He was up 3 nights running, he and Buckwheat and the stable lantern, and the careful management of a problem that required constant attention. Hester brought him food and hot coffee to the barn both the first and second nights, bundled in her heavy coat with her hair loose under her hat, and sat with him for a while each time, not because she could do more than he was doing for the horses, but because she understood that company matters during long vigilance. On the 3rd night, when the freeze had passed and the foals were safe and Roy came in from the barn in the gray pre-dawn light, she was at the stove with coffee made, and the look in her face when he came through the door was exactly what he had seen in those 2 photographs, that quality of presence of being fully there, entirely herself, not performing anything, just present and warm and real. "They are all right," she said. "All right," he said. She handed him the coffee and he sat at the table, and she sat across from him in the early light, and they were quiet together for a moment. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Yes." "I have been thinking these 3 nights in the barn," he said, "about the photograph, the first one, the one I found in the Bible." She looked at him with attention. "I have wondered sometimes what it means," he said, "whether it means anything beyond coincidence. I am not a man who believes in fate in the simple sense. I do not think the world arranges itself for particular people's benefit." "I agree with you," she said. "But I think," he said carefully, "that what I believe in is this: that we were both the kind of people who kept going toward what we intended without knowing exactly where it led. You chose the West deliberately. I chose to build here deliberately. We both used the correspondence arrangement honestly, said what we were rather than performing something easier. And then the photograph, whatever its origin and meaning, was there as well." He paused. "I think what I mean is that the improbable thing happened because we were both moving in directions that made it possible." Hester was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup. "My father used to say," she said slowly, "that good things happen to people who keep doing the right thing, not as a guarantee, because there is no guarantee, but as an increased probability." He was very cautious about anything that sounded like mysticism, but he believed in the compounding effect of honest effort. "I think your father was right," Roy said. "I think so too." She looked up at him, And I think you are right. We were both going somewhere that we did not know the name of yet, and when we arrived, we recognized each other." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "I want you to know," he said, "that I would do all of it again. Every mile of cattle drive and every winter of silence and every fence post. All of it, to arrive at this table in this house with you." Hester held his hand and looked at him with her particular full attention, the expression that had looked out from both photographs, alive and real and entirely present. "So would I," she said. "Every mile of Missouri and every difficult seam and every letter I wrote not knowing if the man I was writing to was someone I could love." She paused. "Every bit of it to be here." He brought her hand up and held it against his face for a moment, and she turned it and held his jaw in her palm. "Roy," she said. "Yes. I am very glad it was you," she said. "Of all the responses to all the letters any agency in any territory could have placed in front of me, I am glad it was you." "I am glad it was me too," he said. She laughed, sudden and bright, and he laughed with her in the early morning light of the kitchen they had made together. The years of the middle 1880s settled into a pattern that Roy could only describe as abundance, not in any extravagant sense, but in the deep sense of a life that was producing what it was meant to produce. The horse operation had grown to a proper business, referenced throughout the territory for quality and fair dealing. The cattle partnership with Cal continued to be profitable. The school had become a point of genuine pride for redemption, with Hester at the center of it, having transformed not only what the children learned, but the community's sense of what was possible for them. William turned 5 and then 6 and became increasingly his father's shadow at the barn and his mother's captive audience in the evenings, a child who asked questions with relentless precision and was dissatisfied with vague answers, which meant that both his parents were kept very much on their intellectual toes. Roy found that William's questions sometimes led him to examine things he had always known in ways he had never examined them, which was an unexpectedly good outcome of parenthood. Clara was the sunnier of the two, easier in her expressions, quicker to attach to people. She loved the horses with a pure and uncomplicated devotion that Roy recognized as early aptitude. By the time she was 2.5, she was demanding to be held up to see the horses over the fence, and Roy obliged with a frequency that Hester occasionally noted was perhaps contributing to the horses receiving insufficient attention, because her husband was always holding a small girl up to pet them. "They seem to enjoy it," Roy said. "The horses or Clara?" "Both," he said, "though Clara perhaps more." The Vega family had expanded their farm significantly, and Tomas Vega had become one of Roy's most reliable associates in the horse business, a man of sharp practical judgment who had also, by 1885, become as close a friend as Roy had. The families shared meals often, Sunday afternoons at each other's tables that had become a fixture of the week. Hester and Alina Vega had a friendship of genuine depth, the kind built on actual regard and shared work rather than proximity alone. Cal and Margaret Briggs were as solid as the mountains. Cal's health had become a mild concern in 1884, a winter illness that had gone deep and taken time to clear, but he had come through it, and by spring was himself again, though Margaret had quietly adjusted the scale of their operation to something more manageable. They were still at every meeting, every gathering, still the particular kind of friends who showed up when showing up mattered. In the late spring of 1886, Hester sat Roy down at the kitchen table in the evening with the purposeful air of someone who had been thinking something through thoroughly. "I am expecting another child," she said. Roy looked at her. "The third time," she said. "I am not alarmed by it. I am simply telling you." He got up from his chair and went to her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also going to need to think about the school arrangement because I will need someone to take over my mornings for some period. I have a candidate in mind. Young Dorothy Fletcher has been helping me part-time, and she is better with the younger children than I am." Roy laughed. Only you would tell me you are expecting a child, and in the next breath, tell me about your candidate to cover your teaching schedule. Both things are equally true and require addressing, she said with complete seriousness, and then her mouth curved. He put his arms around her and held her for a moment. I am very happy, he said. Again. Good, she said. So am I. Now sit down. I want to work out the timing of the school arrangements, and I need you to tell me if you think the finances can support bringing Dorothy on part-time. He sat down and they worked through the school finances, and then talked for a long time about everything else, about the children and the horses and the garden, and what it would mean to add a third person to their family. And the lamp burned down slowly, while the night came in over the territory and everything was as it should be. Their third child was born in December of 1886, a boy they named Edward, who arrived into the world with considerable noise and immediately distinguished himself as the most vigorous of the three. Roy held him in the stable lamp's glow after Margaret had been and gone, and the house was quiet, and thought, for the last time with the particular weight it had once carried, of the photograph. He thought of it not as a mystery now, but as a beginning, as the first moment of a story that had been very long in the telling but had been told properly in the end. The image of a young woman standing in front of a building, holding her bonnet by its ribbon, looking directly into whatever was in front of her. He looked at Hester, who was already asleep with the natural and total exhaustion of childbirth, her dark hair loose on the pillow, her face at rest. She was 30 years old now, and she was more beautiful to him than any image had been, not because images fail, but because she had become, over 7 years of shared life, inseparable from everything that gave his own life its meaning. Her face at rest looked exactly like the face in both photographs and nothing like them, because those photographs had caught a moment, and what he knew now was the whole, moving, living reality of her. He settled the baby into the cradle he had built the previous month, more carefully than the one he had built for William, and then rebuilt when it proved inadequate, this one solid and perfect. He sat in the chair beside it for a while and then got up and went back and looked at Hester sleeping. He went to the table where the Bible still sat and where, in the back cover, both photographs were still kept, face to face as he had placed them on that night in the first winter when he had told her the truth. He looked at the older one, the salvaged one, the one that had started everything. He closed the Bible and left it where it was and blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark, in the warm house he had built with his own hands, with the sound of his son's small breathing from the cradle, and the knowledge of his wife sleeping in the next room and his other children somewhere in the safe dark of the house. And he felt the full weight of his own contentment like a good blanket laid over everything. In the morning Hester woke when Edward woke, in the gray early light, and Roy was already up with coffee made and William and Clara at the table eating breakfast with the efficient practicality of children who had long since understood morning routines. William was 8 now and had appointed himself a figure of tremendous responsibility in family matters. Clara was 5 and had her own ideas about everything and was not afraid to share them. William looked at his mother when she appeared in the doorway holding Edward with the careful, slightly astonished look of a woman who has just produced a third person and is taking stock. "Is that him?" William said. "That is him," Hester said. "He is quite small," William said, the way a child who was himself once quite small fails to remember it. "You were also quite small," Roy said. William received this information skeptically. Clara got down from her chair and came to stand in front of her mother and look up at the baby with an expression of solemn appraisal. Then she put out one finger and touched the baby's hand, and Edward's fingers closed around it with the automatic grip of the newborn. And Clara looked up at Hester with an expression of complete transformation, as if every opinion she had ever held about the world had just been reorganized around this new fact. "He is holding me," Clara said. "He is," Hester said. "He knows me already," Clara said with absolute certainty. Hester looked at Roy over Clara's head, and her eyes were soft and bright, and he looked back at her with everything he had in him. Every year of the trail and every winter of silence and every fence post and every letter and every improbable circling thing that had brought him here. By 1888, Redemption was a proper town, which was the ordinary miracle of frontier places that survived their first decade. It had a larger school, in a proper building now, with Hester as the head of it and Dorothy Fletcher as a full-time second teacher. It had a second general store, a newspaper that published weekly, a proper doctor who had come out from the East and set up a genuine surgery, and 2 churches. The Dusty Rose still operated, somewhat more respectably than in its origins. Roy's horse operation had a reputation that extended to Santa Fe and beyond. He employed 2 men full-time, brothers named Archer Rowe and Miguel Santos, who had come up from the South with skills that Roy had immediately recognized and compensated fairly for. He had also, in that respect, made sure that the Santos brothers were treated as full partners in their work, paid properly and respected accordingly, which was not universally the practice in the territory, and which Roy held to as a matter of principle. He had worked alongside Mexican men and black men in his years on the cattle drives, and had formed his opinion about worth early, that it had nothing to do with anything other than the quality of a man's character and work. He said as much to William one afternoon when the boy was 9, and had come home from town with some ugliness. He had overheard that Roy wanted addressed directly. He sat the boy down and talked to him about it plainly, about how the territory had been shaped by many peoples long before the current wave of settlement, about the injustices that had been done and continued to be done, about how a man's responsibility was to see what was true, and to conduct himself rightly regardless of what was convenient or customary. He was honest about the limits of what he personally could do and clear about what he personally would always do. William listened with the focus that characterized him. At the end he said, "Is that why Archer Rowe and Miguel eat dinner here sometimes?" "That is one reason," Roy said. "The other reason is that they are our friends and good men eat dinner together when they can." William nodded, satisfied, in the way children are satisfied by answers that are both honest and complete. Hester, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, caught Roy's eye when William went back outside. She said nothing, only gave him a look that carried everything: approval, love, the particular quality of shared conviction between 2 people who have talked about these things in the night and arrived at the same place. He carried that look for the rest of the day. Their life had the depth of the lived, the richness of the built. Roy was 38 in 1889, and he was, in every meaningful sense of the word, home. Not just in the house or on the land, but in himself, in his own life, in the company of the person who had become so intertwined with his sense of the world that he could no longer imagine the shape of anything without her. Hester was 33, and was, if anything, more herself than ever, which was his particular measure of well-being for her. The school consumed significant energy, and gave significant energy back. She had eventually gotten a response from the territorial authority that had turned into an actual program, a modest one, but real. A traveling teacher training arrangement that brought her to 2 other settlements twice a year to work with their teachers, which she did with characteristic thoroughness and found enormously satisfying. On an October evening in 1889, 10 years from when she had stepped off the stage in Redemption in her green dress, they were sitting in their chairs by the fire in the evening, William somewhere with a book, Clara playing with her dolls in the corner with half her attention on the adult conversation, and Edward asleep. Roy had been quiet for a while in the comfortable way they were sometimes quiet. Hester put down her book and looked at him. "You are thinking about something," she said. "I am thinking about something," he agreed. "Are you going to tell me, or are you going to look at the fire for another hour?" He smiled. "I was thinking about the auction in Abilene," he said. "In the summer of 1878, about finding that box of goods." She looked at him. "About finding the Bible," he said. "About the photograph." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about it?" "I have been thinking about it because I have been thinking about how extraordinary the whole of it is," he said, "and I wanted to tell you. Again. Not as a story I have told before, but as something I understand more now than I did." She folded her hands in her lap and gave him her full attention. "I was very lonely," he said. "Before. Not consciously so, in the way of complaint, but deeply so. The kind of loneliness that comes from a life that is full of useful things and empty of someone to share them with. And I picked up that photograph and something in me answered it, answered the particular quality of that face, and I carried that answer with me for a year and a half, not knowing what I was carrying it toward. And now," she said. "Now I think," he said carefully, "that what I was carrying was not a delusion but a true thing that was ahead of its time. The face was real, the person was real, the feeling was real. It just had to travel a long way before it had anything to hold on to." Hester looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I have thought about the photograph too," she said. "My photograph being in that man's Bible, being sold at auction, being in a box of goods that you happened to buy." She paused. "I do not know what the explanation is. Perhaps there is none that would satisfy a philosophical examination." "Perhaps not," he said. "But I know this," she said. "I know that I sat down to write a letter to a man I had never met, and I chose how to write it very carefully. I wrote what was actually true rather than what I thought might be appealing. I showed myself as I was, and I received in return a letter from a man who did exactly the same thing. And that, I think, is the actual explanation, whatever the photographs mean or do not mean." "That we were both honest," he said. "That we were both honest," she agreed. "And that honesty, offered into the unknown, found its way to more honesty." He looked at her across the firelight, at this woman whose face he had loved before he knew her name, whose letters he had read and reread, whose handshake he had felt on the first day and whose hand he had held through everything since. "Come here," he said. She got up from her chair and came to sit beside him in his, which she did sometimes, tucking herself against his side in the way that was theirs. He put his arm around her. Clara looked up from her dolls and then returned to them without comment, accustomed to this. "I love you," Roy said, "completely, with everything." "I know," Hester said, "and I love you the same way, with everything." She rested her head against his shoulder. "I think I may have started when I read your first letter." "What did I say in the first letter?" "You said the nearest doctor was also the preacher," she said. "You said the church had a proper bell. You said you did not currently have a dog but had nothing against them in principle." She paused. It was the qualifying precision of that last sentence. I thought, this is someone who actually thinks about what he is saying. Roy laughed quietly. "That was your opening." "That was my opening," she agreed. "And I thought, at minimum, here is someone I could have an honest conversation with." "And now," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel the quality of her silence, warm and full in content. "Now," she said, "I think there is no one in the world I would rather have the honest conversation with than you, about everything, for as long as there is anything to say." He tightened his arm around her. "That is going to be a very long time," he said. "I am counting on it," she said. The fire burned. Outside, the New Mexico territory lay under its enormous sky, the stars beginning to appear in the early dark, the mountains invisible but present, the land they had worked and built and intended together stretching out in all its difficulty and beauty. The house was warm. The children were present. The horses were in the stable and the cattle on the land. Roy reached over to the small table beside the chair and picked up the Bible that still lived there, and opened the back cover where both photographs remained, face to face, and looked at them for a moment. The original. The unknown woman in front of the general store, holding her bonnet by its ribbon, looking out with a quality of defiant, open presence that he had recognized as something rare and true. The second. The one sent by the agency in Santa Fe in November of 1879. The same woman, the same posture, a different dress, a different building, but unmistakably and undeniably the same person. Hester's photographs, both of them. His wife sleeping in his arms, their daughter playing in the corner, their son safe and present. He closed the Bible and put it back. Hester stirred slightly. "What are you doing?" she said drowsily. "Nothing," he said, looking at the photographs. She said, "Put them away. You do not need photographs anymore." "No," he said, "I do not need photographs anymore." He held her and watched the fire and listened to the sound of the house around him, the small sounds of an inhabited life, a life that was completely and irreversibly his, that had arrived through improbable channels and stayed through every honest effort they had both made, and that was, in all its ordinary and extraordinary particulars, everything he had ever wanted without knowing what to call it. He blew out the lamp some time later. The fire had burned to embers. Hester woke enough to go to bed, pressing a kiss against his jaw in passing in the way she always did, the way that had become so familiar it was part of his knowledge of the world. He settled Clara, who had fallen asleep in the corner, into her bed. He checked on the boys. He stood for a moment in the hallway of his house in the dark, listening to everyone breathe. Then he went to bed himself, to the warmth of Hester beside him, to the deep quiet of the land they had chosen and the life they had built, to the absolute and unhurried certainty of a love that had found them through improbable means and made itself permanent through everything that came after. The stars over New Mexico territory turned slowly through the winter dark, and the mountains stood in their ancient patience, and in a house on good claimed land outside the town of Redemption, a man slept beside the woman whose face he had once loved without knowing her name, and there was nothing left unresolved between them, and nothing left unbuilt that had been worth building, and everything was, finally and completely, whole.